Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Voice the SASHA PoShcast, your go-to podcast for all things posh. I am Shweta Bhatt from Team SASHA, your host, and man am I excited. In this episode, we will be taking a deep dive into the law and also talking a bit about the concept of consent, the theory and practice of it, and how it relates to sexual harassment. When we at Team SASHA first thought of coming up with a podcast, we discussed on why we were doing it, what we hope to create with this podcast. We came to the conclusion that we'd like to share our experiences and collective learnings from all these years working in this field. We felt that while there is plenty of information out there around sexual harassment and its prevention, we wanted to focus on experiential narratives, perspectives, and insights gained from working and understanding the ground realities. This podcast aims to foster a space for listening and understanding, for food for thought in an area being bombarded with news and information. In this episode of the POSHcast, we will talk about the law and its evolution. Later on, we will look at consent and how it is learnt at an early age. Chances are that you've heard about the Sexual Harassment of Women at the Workplace, Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act of 2013. You've either read about it in the news, or taken an awareness session, or are part of the internal committee or POSH committee in your workplace. But do you know what all this act entails, where it comes from, and how it came to be an act here in India? Over 50 countries have prohibited sexual harassment at work, either through national legislation or labor codes. India became one amongst this esteemed list in 2013. In order to understand the history of the POSH Act and to appreciate its context, we need to travel back in time to the early 90s, to the village of Batheri in Rajasthan, to the life of a woman called Bhavri Devi. Bhavri Devi worked as a Sathin for the Rajasthan state government. A Sathin is a social worker. Her job was to prevent child marriages in her village. One day she successfully stopped an infant's wedding in the wealthy, influential, upper caste Gujjar household, and because of this, she and her husband were ostracized by the villagers. They were farmers and potters, and no one bought their pots and produce, no one sold them milk, etc. They faced many obstacles daily, but they somehow continued their life. One day, some of the Gujjar men went down to the farm where Bhavri Devi and her husband were working. They beat him up and they gang raped her. She went to file a police complaint and faced many challenges, right from the indifference and skepticism of the police, disbelief in her complaint, victim shaming, to difficulties in police procedure and evidence collection. The verdict finally came out on November 15, 1995 in the District and Sessions Court in Jaipur, and the accused men were acquitted. If you look at old newspaper articles of the coverage of this event, you will encounter a few reasons cited by the judge for the acquittal of these men. Reasons like an upper caste man could not have defiled himself by raping a lower caste woman, and a middle-aged man from an Indian village could not possibly have participated in the gang rape or in the presence of his own nephew. Although Bhavri Devi never received justice, her case brought about significant victories for women in creating safe working environments. With her case in focus, Vishakha, which is a women's group, and a number of other women's groups filed a PIL, public interest litigation, in the Supreme Court to enforce fundamental rights of working women. Vishakha and the women's groups put forth the perspective that Bhavri Devi was only doing her job, that she attracted the anger of her assaulters solely on the basis of her work. Hence, the petition resulted in the Supreme Court's landmark judgment of August 1997, where a set of procedural guidelines provided the basic definitions of sexual harassment at the workplace and laid down requirements for all employers in dealing with complaints of sexual assault, abuse, and harassment. These came to be known very famously as the Vishakha Guidelines. The Vishakha Guidelines were a turning point in Indian history in the perspective of sexual harassment prevention and redressal. However, these guidelines were just that, guidelines for the organizations to follow. The guidelines did not have any penalties for workplaces that were non-compliant, and it so happened that many workplaces were non-compliant. They either did not have committees, or they tried to suppress complaints in some cases, or even retaliated or punished complainants for coming up with a complaint. So without this accountability, working women who faced sexual harassment were once again back to square one, in that limited to either contacting the media or to go to the police, and many women chose not to do either. So these guidelines were incorporated as a proper legislative act in 2013. One of the major driving forces was the outrage and protests that broke out after Nirbhaya happened. Around that time, we saw the introduction of this POSH Act as well as the POCSO Act of 2012, which is the Protection of Children Against Sexual Offences Act. The POSH Act brought about a much-needed structure of accountability on employers. As per the Act, any organization that does not comply with the provisions of this Act, that does not have a committee, or that intervenes in the inquiry process, is liable to penalties, and these can be heavy fines, or in some cases, business licenses can be revoked. For example, in a recent judgment, the Indore bench of the Madhya Pradesh High Court slapped a penalty of 50,000 rupees on Medanta Hospital of Indore for not having an internal committee. The court also directed the hospital to pay a compensation of 25 lakhs to the complainant for failing to address her complaint. So, you must be wondering, all this is interesting, but how is it relevant to my workplace? As per the Act, every organization that has less than 10 employees must comply with its provisions. Let's look at the provisions from the point of view of employees. Say an employee has experienced an uncomfortable incident and wants to file a complaint. They can look up the contact details of the internal committee, which is a committee specifically set up for this purpose. They can look it up on notice boards or on the intranet portal, or they can ask HR about it. They can be aware of the transparent and fair process of redressal via the POSH policy that every organization has to have. They are aware that sexual harassment and boundary violations are something that they need not tolerate, thanks to the regular awareness sessions that they undergo. The committee itself undergoes regular training and is equipped to deal with any issue with competence. The employees have trust in their IC and in their employer, and they speak up against behaviors of this kind, and they stand up for each other. And now a little bit on what we have been up to. On 10th December, Kanti from Team SASHA and I got to attend a listening circle facilitated by the British Deputy High Commission, Bengaluru, in association with Jain University, Radioactive 90.4 MHz and On Purpose. This was with the objective of driving community conversations in line with the theme of #HearMeToo as part of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. This is an annual international campaign that kicks off on 25th November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and runs until 10th December, which is Human Rights Day. Now, this event was attended by advocates, activists, writers, filmmakers, media professionals, and educators. The speakers discussed on a variety of topics, including media coverage of #MeToo conversations, unlearning gender myths, queerness and objectification, and mental health and gender. Yours truly was also one of the speakers, and I spoke on consent and harassment. How does a child understand consent? How do we learn consent, and how do boundary violations impact our ability to ask and give consent later on in life? This formed the crux of my piece. As children, we learn not only by what our elders tell us, but also, and more so, by how they themselves behave around us. The other day, I was visiting a friend, and she has a 5-year-old daughter. I was playing with her daughter in the hall when an elderly neighbor entered. He came just to say hi, and he came and he sat down on the sofa, and he saw that little girl And he broke into a smile, and he immediately, slapped his thigh and asked the little girl to come near him. So the implication was very clear. He was inviting her to come sit on his thigh. What was really interesting was she looked at him very calmly and she said no. And then she just stood there. She seemed very calm, but all of a sudden, there was a mix of emotions running through me. I was reminded of similar instances when I was growing up, when relatives and well-meaning neighbors, well-meaning or not, neighbors would come by and ask to either hug us as children or pinch our cheeks or make us sit on laps. Now, while their intentions might have been very genuine, we were not always comfortable with their affection, especially the physical expression of their affection. But we were too scared to say no. So I was thinking about, if I had been as a child in that place, would I have said no that calmly? If I had said no, would it be taken as I'm being rude? If I had looked to my parents, would my parents have then forced me to sit on the uncle's lap? When in that moment, when the little girl said no, I looked at her mother. Her mother looked squarely at that neighbor and said, she's not feeling comfortable. There was a moment of awkwardness, and then life went on. It was a very interesting thing for me to witness, because it reminded me that when we talk about sexual consent, we talk a lot about how no means no, and there's a lot of conversation around it. We talk about learning to say no to behavior that makes us uncomfortable or demeans us. We are also talking about learning to say yes and no in the general sense. It is not just limited to sexual consent. The way children pick up the concept of consent is based on what they learn about respecting others. For example, growing up, a lot of us might have learned that if we say no, if we disagree with someone, that is equated with disobedience or disrespect, especially if that someone is older. Learning consent is also linked very closely to how we navigate family dynamics. For example, was our family close-knit? Were we allowed space? It is linked to how children develop individually. Some of us are okay having awkward conversations like this, and were okay maybe as children. Some of us were not and are not. Children also learn to connect consent with the idea of niceness. For example, in my native place, we sit down to eat food during functions in front of banana leaves, and the women of the house serve the food to the guests. And there's a little dance that takes place, a little dance of politeness and courtesy, wherein when someone offers you some extra rice or kheer, you are supposed to say no first. It is sort of an unwritten rule. And the hostess pushes you once. You still say no. And the hostess pushes you twice. And the third time you say, yeah, okay, I'll have some. This is supposed to be done whether you really want that extra rice or not. It is a very quaint custom, but it also points a lot to what we have learned about being nice and not rocking the boat, so to speak. And what we learn forms the foundation of how we behave and respond to abuse, to harassment, to consent violations as adults. Years after Bhavri Devi's struggle, many complainants still hesitate. Years after Bhavri Devi's struggle, many complainants still hesitate to talk about their experiences, to bring up complaints. Why? There are many factors at play here. There's much to uncover. It is a topic with so many layers and complexities, and I feel it all ties in together. Even when it comes to sexual harassment never happens in isolation. It is tied into mindsets and cultural beliefs, to learning and early experiences. So, penalties, while they do help, will not really help in solving the deep rooted problems in the long run. It's more about social conditioning. When our goal is a safe and inclusive workplace, mere compliance is not really sufficient. The basic provisions of the Act cover prevention, prohibition, as well as redressal. But in addition to these steps, many companies employ best practices with the intent of creating and maintaining safe, respectful, inclusive workplaces. For example, here's what Meera Krishnan, who is the presiding officer at Tavan Technologies, has to say about a practice followed by her team.
Hi, my name is Meera and I am the presiding officer at Tawant. Considering the enormous analytics and insight about majority of incidents occurring or getting reported during team outings, we at Tawant have instituted an awareness week. This seeks to further equip our leaders on handling delicate and sensitive issues that could potentially be precursors to sexual harassment at workplace. We reiterate and emphasize on timelines and sensitivity in dealing with matters that are deterrent to our mission of creating a safe and respectful workplace for our employees.
And here's what Rajni GP, who is an IC member at Robert Bosch, has to say about a practice that they follow.
Hi, I'm Rajni from Robert Bosch. Bosch firmly believes in the right of every associate to a work environment free from harassment, intimidation, or offensive behavior. We engage in creative methods to sensitize our diverse workforce with different backgrounds, geographies, and generations. One such method is the theatre play, with different scenarios of sexual harassment, which is entertaining yet very powerful in making people aware of their responsibilities. This method reaches a wide mass of associates in educating them on what amounts to sexual harassment, where they can reach out to report incidents.
And so that was our episode, dear listeners. What did you think about our very first episode? Did you have fun? Did you learn something? Did it make you think? Do you have a question regarding the law or the steps every workplace needs to take? Write to us with your queries and inputs at voice@sashaindia.com or get in touch with the external member of your internal committee. This is Shweta Bhatt, your host, signing off. We'll meet again with our second episode on the 15th of January 2020. Can you believe it is already the end of a decade? A very happy new year and a happy new decade to you in advance. And remember, to prevent and protect is to progress.